to introduce today's session, which is using the power of early brain development to promote equity for children and families with Dr. Terry McFadden. Dr. McFadden, FAAP, MD, is a professor of pediatrics at Emory University School of Medicine, where she serves as an attending physician in the primary care center at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta at Hughes Spalding. Dr. McFadden also provides direction for the clinical initiatives at Partners for Equity in Child and Adolescent Health, which is also in the Department of Pediatrics at Emory University. The purpose of the partners is to increase access to healthcare and to improve the health outcomes for at-risk children and adolescents in the state of Georgia. Dr. McFadden received her medical degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland, and completed her pediatrics residency at Emory University School of Medicine. So we're just so pleased that she could join us here today and take it away. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm speaking as a member of the Ready Nation Brain Science Speakers Bureau. And so I'm going to ask you if you would take a moment to take a picture of the QR code and answer a few questions about your knowledge about early brain, just to help us as we go forward. Ready Nation is a national nonpartisan nonprofit that works with business leaders to help create a strong workforce and economy by supporting education really from cradle to career. And the Brain Science Speakers Bureau is a project that started with the support of the Bezos Family Foundation after they learned about or became informed about early brain and how important it is for our society. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to have this discussion with you today. So over the next 30, 40 minutes, we're going to run through research explaining why the earliest years are so critical. And I'll talk about what we absolutely know about how early brains grow, how stress can affect the brain of young children, how brain development influences later adult behaviors, and how we ensure that our children get the support they need to flourish later in life. So there's a lot of new brain science, but I always say it's what your grandmother used to know, right? Used to tell you, but now there's science and evidence to support, Granny's theories about what it takes to raise healthy, strong children. But today we'll also talk about utilizing brain science to create equitable communities. We'll discuss health equity and its importance, compare equity and equality, contrast disparities and inequities, discuss social determinants of health, and describe how we can be successful as advocates for children and families. Our focus on brain development is really about utilizing this time and capitalizing on a period that can really put a child on track to do well. We know that all children can be successful, that success is achievable even when there's adversity, and that children are pretty resilient. But our goal is to provide the support that parents and children and communities need to make sure that their children get off to the best possible start that they can. We also want to understand the activities and actions that undermine good brain development. So we're off. And so what is health equity? Well, let's ground our discussion in a description of health equity. The WHO says it's the absence of avoidable, unfair, or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are divided socially, economically, geographically, demographically, or by any other way that we stratify people into groups. Health equity, or the equity in health, implies that ideally everyone should have a fair opportunity to attain their full health potential, and that no one should be disadvantaged from achieving this potential. Dr. Kamara Jones talks about it a little bit more succinctly. She says, health equity is assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. Achieving health equity requires valuing all individuals and all populations equally, and that we recognize and rectify historical injustice, and that we provide resources according to need. So this is obviously a very long list of definitions related to health equity, and I'm not going to read through all of them for you. I will spotlight a few because I think that It's important to have this lexicon as we think about health equity. Ableism, right? Classism, racism, ethnicity, structural competency, and root causes. These are all important terms as we think about health equity and what that means. Culture and cultural competence or cultural sensitivity. So you've probably seen this graphic or one similar to it before that describes the difference between equity and equality. That equity refers to fairness and justice, and it's different from equality. Equality means providing the same thing to everybody. But equity recognizes that we don't all start at the same place. So as you see those little people with those trying to pick the apples, if you give everybody the same size box, yes, you've been equal in your distribution of resources, but that little guy really can't reach the tree to pick his apples, right? On the other hand, if you give folks what they need to be successful, then they're much more likely to be successful, right? That equality sounds like it's fair, but equity really is fair. I also like this graphic from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation because I think it helps us to understand equity in a different way. That, you know, from an equality lens, we are giving everybody that same bicycle. Yes, we gave everybody a bicycle, but the person who's in the wheelchair can't use it. It's too big for the little guy. It's too small for the big guy. So we can't necessarily expect that they're going to win any races on those bicycles we've given them, even though we've been very diligent in giving them all bicycles. It turns out that social inequity is what leads to health disparities. So I'll point out, we'll highlight a few instances, examples of health disparities, like maternal rates by geography, race, maternal mortality rates, by geography, race, ethnicity, education, infant mortality rates, life expectancy across locations, and COVID-19 death rates, as we've all unfortunately become acquainted with. So on your left, the chart on your graph on your left describes infant mortality rates in 2017, and that dark blue bar in the middle is the infant mortality rate for all races and ethnicities. But if you look to your far left, you can see that Black non-Hispanic infants have almost double the rate of infant mortality of all races, ethnicities, and even more when you compare them to white or Asian babies. And American Indian or Alaskan natives are right behind them, as are Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. On the right, you can see a map of the US, and you can see I live in Georgia, and we're in that southeast infant mortality, maternal mortality, everything bad belt, basically, where you see dark blue, really dark blue, almost black in that whole area. Now, I know a lot of you are from New Mexico, and it's funny, New Mexico shows up as either having very few infant deaths or having unreliable data. So I'm not sure which, but note that, huge disparities around geography. If we look at maternal mortality, we can see that pregnancy-related mortality ratios are 3.2 times higher for Black women and 2.3 times higher for American Indian, Alaskan Native women than white women. And you can see those two green bars. Now, this is a map of Atlanta. If any of you have ever been to Atlanta, you see those interstate arteries, 75, 85, 20. If you've done Atlanta traffic, this makes you scream. But it should make you scream for another reason, which is that if you look at Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, you can see that life expectancy can vary by as much as 12 years, depending on what part of the city you actually live in. That's pretty astounding. Now, we're all very familiar with racial disparities around COVID-19 mortality. In the early months, of the pandemic, it started to emerge, the data started to emerge showing that Black residents were, from somewhere between 3 and 7 times more likely to die from COVID, depending on where you were in the country. And as we go forward and cumulatively look at that data for the 3 years that we've been living in COVID, you can see that Black residents are still much more likely to die from COVID than white and Asian residents. But look, Hispanic citizens more likely, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native, which have been right. The American Indian and Alaska Native indigenous populations have been right there with Black residents, and you can see now actually exceed the rates. This is a very complicated model, a conceptual model of why we may have seen those health disparities in COVID-19. And I won't try to walk through all of it with you, but just to say that, you know, there are preconditions before COVID and different conditions during COVID that probably shaped the disparities that we saw. Pre-existing structural contexts like economic disparities, health disparities that already existed, superimposed onto those COVID-19 folks that had job and income loss or were essential workers and were forced to be you know, up close and personal with other people all the time. And then what was their access to care? So again, interesting, you know, we could do a full talk on all of this, but I'm going to try to speed through so we have lots of time for questions. So now we've talked about disparities, and I hope I've convinced you that there are lots of disparities, but you know, it probably is better that we talk about inequities versus just talking about disparities. So health disparities refers to a higher burden of illness, injury, disability, or mortality that one group experiences relative to another. It really focuses on individual outcomes or outcomes for specific subgroups of the population. And it's just a mathematical difference. It's the yardstick that we use to measure how well we're doing, are we progressing towards equity? But it doesn't really get at what's causing the difference, right? So health inequities are a measurable systemic, avoidable, and unjust difference in healthcare, usually access, utilization, quality, and outcomes between groups that really stems from differences in levels of social advantage and disadvantage. And so when you talk about inequities, you're drawing attention to the social, economic, cultural, and environmental conditions that really contribute to health outcomes at a population level. For instance, if all the people in who live in downtown Atlanta are people who are disadvantaged from an economic standpoint, we know that the heat island in the city is as much as there's a heat island in the city in the middle of the summer, and the temperature may be 8 degrees higher than it is in suburbia. And so those people may be at higher risk from asthma or other heat-related illnesses. If you just look at the difference, you say, oh, those city dwellers, they always have more asthma, but you need to understand why. So using a health inequity, the terminology recognizes those differences as being unjust, avoidable, unnecessary, and really unfair, and not just a calculus of how folks are different. So why should we care about health equity or inequity? I mean, I know the answers are obvious, but just to spotlight a few for you. You know, equity is an important component of quality and safety. If we're providing high quality services, we want to be providing them to everyone in a way that helps to make their lives better. Our medical societies, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I belong to, has defined equity as an essential element of our profession. We should be focusing on it. Same for public health entities. Focusing on equity is really about ethics and fairness and justice as well. Don't we want folks to all have access to the things that they're entitled to, especially when it comes to health? There's an impact on our national economy. If folks aren't healthy, they can't fully participate in the economy, which makes life better for all of us. There are excess health expenditures related to inequity and illness-related lost productivity, premature death that again feed into the economy. Then there's the life course theory, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but this notion that the things that happen early in our lives can really set the course for what will happen later in our lives, what our adult experiences will be like, what our adult health will be. From a societal well-being standpoint, we want everyone to be successful. Again, our society is at its best when everybody is able to function at their greatest potential. And finally, for those of us who focus on the well-being of who focus on families and children, we know that the well-being of children and families really requires a focus on equity, where we're trying to make sure that children have everything they need to be successful. And it may be different between one child and another. So where does all of this inequity come from? Well, there are a lot of reasons that we see it, but I think it's important to spotlight some of the historical narratives around health. These narratives are collective stories that help us to give meaning, right? They help us to explain what we're experiencing in our daily walk, and they're woven into the fabric of our everyday life. They're things we sort of take for granted. They're beliefs. Well, you know, such and such always happens. But they also shape public opinion. They shape our language, our thinking, our action. And more importantly, it informs the questions that we ask about adverse health outcomes. Is the reason that, you know, this gentleman developed lung cancer because he has poor personal responsibility, or did the military give him cigarettes when he was in the military to keep him appeased, and he developed a habit that later led to lung cancer? These narratives percolate into our legal system, our arts, our scientific literature. Even researchers perhaps are not thinking deeply about what the root causes are. It explains economic inequities as a result of market forces. Things just happen. Some people live longer, some people don't. It's all individual behavior. And they make injustice appear like it's natural or something that's inevitable. So examples of these prevailing narratives are race, that it's a biological construct, that, you know, Native American people will have an alcoholism problem, right? Okay, that is not a racial issue. That is about a social construct. We know that race is a social construct. Individualism, that consumer choices are made independently. That there's personal responsibility associated, without thinking about what the drivers are, the structural drivers that drive personal behaviors. Meritocracy, that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you work hard, you can prevail. And that's not always the case, as we know. So if we use an equity lens, we recognize that systems shape institutional practices and living conditions, not just necessarily personal responsibility. And it opens up new ways for us to think about how we frame the questions to make sure that we're asking the right questions, that we're digging deep. So health equity is inextricably linked to social determinants of health. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this. I know you guys all know that, because you really have to consider the impact of social factors if you're thinking about health. And we know that inequity in early life predisposes and contributes to health disparities, health inequities, and vulnerability in later life. And that can have intergenerational impact. So what do I mean by that? Well, not only can social conditions, especially adversity, change the way genes are expressed. A gene can actually methylate, add different change genes, which can change the way those genes are expressed in an individual, but they can also be passed down to other generations. So it's not just a social intergenerational impact, it can be a biological and intergenerational impact. And social determinants, again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this, but I think the WHO says it really nicely when they say health is a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. The absence of disease is not health, right? Health considers all of those domains. And they go on to say that social determinants are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And then the Healthy People 2020 describes how health is determined by access to social and economic opportunities, the resources and supports that are available in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, the quality of our schooling, the safety of our workplaces. Hey, we're all worried about our workplaces given what's been going on throughout the country lately. The cleanliness of our water, food, and air, and the nature of our social interactions and relationships. This is a humbling graphic for me because as a healthcare provider, I would like to believe that, what I do is what really matters for patient outcomes. But this graphic shows us that only 20% of patient health outcomes are attributable to the healthcare they receive. Socioeconomic factors, physical environment, and health behaviors, and that doesn't even get into why the behaviors happen, are much more impactful. So we have to think really upstream if we're going to think about how we impact health of children and families. So as we think about the determinants that lead to the differences in outcomes, there's several possibilities. We won't be able to talk about all of them, but bias is one of them, right? That is one of the things that affects health equity. So you can have explicit bias where that happens due to thought, that you are communicating directly, you are conscious of your actions, you're planned and organized. I don't like purple people, and I'm going to tell them that, right? But then there are the implicit biases, the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and our actions and our decisions in more of an unconscious or subconscious manner. These things happen without us thinking, and they're communicated indirectly, mostly because our brain is just inundated with information. And it makes all of these shortcuts, these connections, just to try to organize information over our lifespan. So a lot of these implicit associations that we don't even realize we have are forming in our brain. But it's important to understand the difference between explicit and implicit biases. So there are also lots of types of bias. We talk a lot about race and ethnicity, but obviously there's bias around religion and ability level, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and age. So can we de-bias our brains? Well, the question for us as people who work with children and families, because we want to, right? There's not good evidence that you can actually totally de-bias your brain. But what you can do is be focused on the fact that you potentially have bias. And I will tell you that we all do. So having awareness and reflecting on why you feel the way you feel, could bias have crept into it? Think about that. Concerns about the effects that bias has, your motivation, application of strategies, your own personal strategies to reduce bias, and understanding our privilege. I always tell my young adult daughters that they are daughters of privilege. They may not have racial privilege, they have economic privilege, they've had educational privilege, they've had all sorts of privilege. So privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It just means that your privileged identity is not the thing that's making it harder. It's not their education that's making it harder for them. It's not their economics, but they do have privilege. We all have some privilege. And the fact is, as people who deal with families and children, we need to think about how we use our privilege to help them. Another way to think about things that impact equity are the economic mobility or social mobility. So this map describes the likelihood that a child can move over their lifetime from the lowest 5th percentile of economics to the top 5th percentile. So the reddest areas are the least likely to be able to move from the bottom 5th to the highest 5th. And that the red area is 4%. The bluest areas are 35%, right? So you can see again, here we are in the southeastern, everything bad for children belt, and you can see a child in Atlanta has a 4% chance of moving from the lowest 5th percentile to the highest 20th percentile. So what does that say? Well, when we talk about meritocracy, that you can just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it doesn't really take into account what is really possible without a focus on equity, right? Because some folks don't have bootstraps, some don't even have boots, right? And so to talk about bootstraps doesn't really deal with the issues that they're dealing with. And why is it so hard? Well, there are a lot of structural issues. This is an example. I don't know if you all have heard of this book called The Color of Law, which talked about the history of redlined neighborhoods in the US. So it turns out that after the Great Depression, the US government wanted to stimulate the economy by investing in neighborhoods and getting people to buy homes and build homes. But they color coded neighborhoods based on the ones that should receive those investments. And Black neighborhoods were coded red for don't invest. And so as you look at those communities now, those redlined, you'll hear people talk about communities remain disproportionately impoverished. Those are places where there's insecure housing that leaves children at risk for physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and not really achieving their fullest potential as children. All right, so how do we help to build health equity for children and families that we serve? Because that's why you guys have come here today, not to necessarily hear all the horror stories. And I would say to you that, I'm here because those goals, the goals that we all have as folks who deal with children and families, the goals of helping children to get a good start, and turn into, reach their full capacity as adults, they're possible. There are all sorts of metaphors for healthy childhood and how that builds communities. But it's important to recognize that there's a window of opportunity for early brain development. Now, it doesn't really close at age 5. There's always the opportunity for continued brain development. But as you'll see as we go forward, the older you get, the more narrow that window becomes. And if we want children to be able to grow into strong adults who have good educational attainment, economic productivity, lifelong health, and become responsible citizens, then we have to invest so that there are strong roots for our communities. Because if the children are healthy and provided the supports they need, then we build strong communities, strong families, and a healthy economy. Think of the DNA, think of our genes as the blueprint for how children are going to grow and develop. But think of the experiences as the soil that makes possible the full and rich growth and development for those children. So think of it that way. So what does brain science tell us about the way brains are built? Well, we know that the basic architecture of the brain is constructed through a process that begins early in life and continues into adulthood. So starting at pregnancy, the brain develops neural connections that form the pathways through which people learn and behave. And as this graph illustrates, the period of most rapid development is those early years. You can see how that graph sort of drops off very steeply in those first few years. Sensory pathways for basic vision and hearing are some of the first to develop. And then we start to build on that foundation with cognitive ability and socio-emotional. So the simple circuits happen early. The more complex circuits build on top of those simple circuits. Like I said before, the genes provide the blueprint, but experience really is what creates the opportunity for those brains to grow healthy and strong. We talk about plasticity of the brain, that the brain is the most plastic in those first few years. And it turns out that the human newborn is probably the most vulnerable of all newborns in the animal kingdom. But it's from that vulnerability and great plasticity that the human brain is able to achieve so much more than any other mammal in the animal kingdom. So this graph again shows you how the brain has the ability to change that decreases pretty sharply over time. And then it also shows you with the orange line how much effort is required to make those changes. Bottom line, invest early, right? That's when that brain is plastic. In the first few years, there's 1 million new neural connections formed every second. That's pretty amazing. And after this period of rapid growth, so you can see in this graph, the newborn has few connections, but quickly they're escalating over that first 2 years. But then what happens? You guys have probably heard of the use it or lose it phenomenon, right? The same is happening with the human brain, because the brain needs to organize itself after it's had this period of such intensive growth. And guess what? Then those neuronal connections start to be pruned. What's pruned? The connections that are not used. So if we're reading to babies, if we're providing them a strong, safe, nurturing environment, if we're interacting with them, if we're talking with them, those are the neural pathways that are being strengthened and are unlikely to be pruned. If we're screaming at them, if we're neglecting them, if we're abusing them, if we're not stimulating them, then the pathways that respond to the negativity, those are the pathways that will be reinforced and strengthened. And those are the ones that are likely to continue. So there's 3 big buckets of actions, if you will, that children need in order to succeed and grow. They need for their mom to be healthy, right, during pregnancy, and then they need to be healthy physically, and they need good nutrition. They also need an early learning environment that's stimulating for them, where parents are talking to them and they feel safe. You hear people talk about roots and wings. And finally, they need a safe, stable, nurturing environment where they're not going to be exposed to toxins. They have caring adults in their lives, or at least one caring adult, and they have what they need to survive and thrive. The Harvard Center for the Developing Child has a very nice framework for thinking about the things that can derail human brain development. And they talk about the different types of stress, because the truth is, stress is not necessarily bad for children. Stress can be bad for children if there's not a caring adult to help mitigate the impact of stress. Plus, it depends on the child and their own makeup. But what the Harvard Center for the Developing Child has categorized stress, they put it into 3 categories. So there's positive stress. So positive stress is, a child meets new people and they're nervous, right? They get dropped off for the first day of school, but they have caring adults who help them to settle down and calm down. They fall down, they scrape something, they might even break something, but there's a caring adult who puts their arms around them and shows them that you can get through things. That helps to build resilience. Then there's tolerable stress. Tolerable stress may not be normative. It may be something really significant, like the death of a parent or a major climatic catastrophe. And again, with the help of a caring adult, that child can experience that stress, can recover from that stress, and recognizes that things happen, but with the love and caring and nurturing of adults, they can recover. However, toxic stress and the toxic stress response is really that significant continuous drip of adversity that child is sort of unrelenting. That child is experiencing that adversity continuously. Plus, there's not an adult there to help mitigate the stress that they're feeling. And so that stress and that stress response gets internalized and can lead to all sorts of injury to the brain and to the body as that child continues to grow. It's not necessarily the stress itself that is injurious. It's really the response to the stress or the lack of response. So that gets us to the ACE study, which I'm sure all of you have heard about by now, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that looked at 17,000 folks from Kaiser Permanente and CDC in the 1990s in California. And they were not an at-risk group, but what they found is that those people who had experienced a different number of ACEs were much more likely to have disrupted, to go on to develop major physical and behavioral challenges. And so the CDC put together this ACEs pyramid as a conceptual framework to understand how those adverse childhood experiences led to disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, coping behaviors, if you will, then disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. But what the ACE pyramid didn't factor was the fact that in addition to those 10 adverse childhood experiences that were being studied, there are all sorts of community adverse childhood experiences like poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, poor housing, and violence that also contributed to brain development in that child. And so the CDC went back and changed the pyramid to add some foundational levels, the generational embodiment of historical trauma, social conditions, and local contexts that then lead basically to those adverse childhood experiences that cause the problems that we're talking about. And we know, as I said, that ACEs can have lasting effects on health, behaviors, and life potential. So, spotlighting some of those adversities that we're talking about. Children in poverty have reduced gray matter volumes. At about 150% of the poverty level, those reductions are 3 to 4%. As you drop down to 100% of poverty, they're 8 to 9% below normal developmental levels, because those children have chronic stress that impacts their brain development. They have levels of cortisol that are high, other stress markers. And if you do an MRI of their brains, you can see that the parts of their brain that are associated with executive function are really affected by poverty. Another spotlight on a developmental, something that can derail development, and that's when a child has an incarcerated parent, which is 1 in 28 of our children, right? And you can see some of the disparities and inequities by race, but when those children have a history of parental incarceration or juvenile justice involvement themselves, they're 2 times likely to have anxiety, 3 times more likely to have depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. This was a nice study by Barth et al. That looked at a variety of adverse kind of experiences that children might have, from having very young parents to having a parent with low education or unemployment. And as you can see, that as you start to layer on different numbers of risk factors, you can get up to almost 100% risk of a child having developmental delays. COVID has been a big issue for all of us, right? With childcare centers closed, parents juggling work and childcare or no work in childcare, parents dealing with food insecurity, uncertainty, family illness, plus the fact that I think the count right now is that over 200,000 children have lost a parent or close caregiver in these 3 years that we've experienced COVID. So this has been a stressful thing for parents and families. But the good news, back to the good news, trajectories are not etched in stone. And we have the ability at every turn to impact children and their development. Yes, the earliest years are the most important. But with that combination of gene, environments, and behaviors and our interventions, we can reduce risk factors and we can build protective factors for children and families. I love this graph because it shows how, if you were looking at the red arrows as risk factors, whether those are social, physical, behavioral, that are going on with the family, and you look at the green arrows as protective factors, you can see that the top graph, the solid line is a child who achieves optimal life trajectory. The dotted line is life trajectory impacted. And you can see that even with a lot of risk factors, if they're overwhelming protective factors, then you can mitigate those risk factors. The problem is that when you have a lot of risk factors, like you see in the bottom graph, with few protective factors, then that's a child whose brain development, child development, and early life course is going to be derailed. We also know that the power of having an adult caregiver who can engage with a child goes without saying. It is so important for that child to feel comfortable and safe. That's when they can learn and thrive. And those social engagements, that ability to interact with other children, to have what we call executive function, where that child has the ability they have memory, they have organization, they can process. That executive function is critical for that child to go on and develop properly. So our goal as professionals who deal with children and families is to create positive childhood experiences, because we know that it's not enough to just not have adverse childhood experiences. Children need positive childhood experiences so that they can flourish. So what do? Well, as professionals who work with children and families, we need to be, and you guys are doing this all the time already, I know, but we are trying to help families to build protective factors, that they have concrete support in times of need, social connections, knowledge of parenting and child development, so they don't have, like my parent of a 9-month-old says, well, she's so mean, she just won't do what I tell her to do. Well, she's 9 months old. They need personal resilience. They need the ability to enhance social and emotional competence in their children, and the ability to foster nurturing and attachment. But we have to go beyond those individual actions that we have with our families to be advocates for communities, because communities can create protective factors too, like safe neighborhoods and high quality schools, safe and stable housing, access to nutritious food, access to job opportunities and medical care and transportation, and childcare that's high quality, and then inclusion and equity related to race, ethnicity, and disability. We know that in order for a child to thrive, they need a caregiver who can be engaged, who builds a relationship with them, and is healthy themselves. And so it is imperative that we are approaching our work with children by thinking about 2-generation interventions, so that we can try to understand what families and parents are going through, things that are impacting their ability to caregive, and address them. So again, the Harvard Center for the Developing Child talks about the fact that in order to improve child outcomes, we have to build adult capabilities. We have to address the issues that adults who are parenting children have, so that they can be the best parent that they can be. And there's 5 key components that the Aspen Institute talks about when we think about the 2-generation approach: that we help families build social capital, that we focus on early child development, again, what you guys are all doing, that we talk about post-secondary and employment pathways for those parents and the children as they're growing older, that we talk about economic assets, and that we focus on the health and well-being, not just of the child, but of the parents. We also have to remove the stigma associated with mental health by normalizing those conversations. I'm sure those of you who are home visitors are doing that all the time, finding ways to make families feel comfortable about mental health, and assessing their readiness to share, following their lead, but trying to link them to services where possible. In the Reach Out and Read space, we talk a lot about relational health. And what we mean by relational health is really seeing that relationship between the dyad or the triad, the mother and baby, the mother, father, and baby. But we know that that's a foundational principle, because if you can't create a safe, nurturing environment for the baby, then they won't become curious learners, and they won't go on do well in school, graduate, and become citizens. And we focus so much on what's above the waterline, right? We talk about school readiness, early literacy, language development, and resilience and getting rid of toxic stress, and that's important. But it's important to understand what's below the waterline too, because language development is a social process. It happens when there's a right exposure, language, when that parent is there interacting with them, and we call those everyday moments. And the reason that's important is because if school readiness, early literacy, language development, those are our goals, then those can only happen when there's a healthy relationship, security, good interaction between the child and the parent, a good environment that really promotes development. Because 95% of the brain is going to be formed in those first 6 years, and those first 1,000 days are really critical. We talked about the 1 million new neural connections that are happening every second. So gaps in word acquisition and early literacy skills really start early. So we have to start early. You've probably seen this Heckman graph before that really looks at the fact that you get your biggest bang for your buck, your biggest return. Dr. Heckman's a Nobel laureate economist, but you see that the more you invest in prenatal programs, the bigger the rate of return is for your investment in capital. By the time you get out here to post-school, you're spending much more money, but you're getting much less return. And we know that these programs work. There's really clear data and evidence that, there's nurse family partnership, one of those evidence-based home visiting programs, right? We know that for every dollar we spend, we receive $5.70 in return. Now, Georgia has had some success in the pre-K early learning space. Our first universal pre-K program started in 1992 and has really been one of the most exciting things that we've done in Georgia. I look to see what's going on in New Mexico. I know that New Mexico launched a pre-K program in 2005, and those programs have been found to be very significant too in terms of both math and language. So kudos to you guys in New Mexico. What else can we do as advocates? Well, there's lots of free science-based parenting resources that we should be pointing out for families, like Text for Baby and 0 to 3 and healthychildren.org, and there's in Vroom, readaloud.org. There are also organizations like Home Visiting Coalition, Firstborn, and my favorite, because I do the most work with it, Reach Out and Read, which are all focused on relational health and making sure that families have what they need to raise strong, resilient children. So as we move towards conclusion, I shared the metaphor of the plant, where the roots are the child development. And when you have good, healthy roots, you grow a strong plant, which is the society and the community. I kind of like this metaphor a little bit better because it describes healthy child development as the foundation for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, lifelong health. And when you create that for children, then they are successful parents for the next generation. And in the end, we create strong communities and a healthy economy. So as I conclude, I think it's important for us to, as we think about what we're supposed to do, what's a child advocate to do? Well, we have to understand how early childhood interventions build healthy and equitable societies. They build individuals, but they build societies too. We have to recognize the importance of supporting young children and families. In this, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we have to change the narrative around health. We have to call out inequitable systems, hierarchy, social structure, and institutional practices, even sometimes within our own institutions that don't support children and families. We have to avoid blaming the individual. We have to encourage public dialogue and foster efforts to strengthen community-driven initiatives. We have to recognize that language matters. One of my colleagues talks about intent versus impact. I didn't intend for this thing to be received that way, but boy, the impact was different from what I expected. Think about our language, what we're saying. And then finally, we have to be an advocate. We have to advocate for evidence-based early childhood interventions like you all are doing with home visiting. We have to advocate for family support and high quality early learning opportunities for children. We have to strongly advocate for both the prevention and mitigation of toxic stress. And we have to always make the voices of those who may not have a seat at the table visible. And that is our children, because if we don't speak for them, no one else does. So I know I've kind of sped through all of that. There was a lot. There's about 4 different lectures in there. Just a reminder about Ready Nation. There's lots of information available at Ready Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the Bezos Family Foundation, the Ready Nation Council, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington, Reach Out and Read, and of course, Firstborn. And I'd like to ask you if you wouldn't mind taking the POST survey using a similar but different QR codes. I don't completely understand the wonder of QR codes, but if you'll take a picture of that and answer the questions, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Looking forward to any questions you might have. Oops. I'll go to the chat. I haven't been able to keep up. Okay. You guys are quiet.
I'm curious how you're seeing, it sounds like you're still practicing medicine, or just what you're hearing or seeing yourself around sort of how medicine and home visiting or other early childhood services can best work together to support the best outcomes.
I am so glad you asked that question. You know, I will say that for the first 10 years of my career, maybe more, I didn't even know what home visiting was. And so I think there's a real disconnect between the medical community and this wonderful home visiting opportunity. So as I have become a convert in my later years, now that I know what home visiting is and I've seen the evidence and know how critical it is, I have been a staunch advocate in my state to try to make sure we have more home visiting. We only have, I think Georgia has 159 counties, and I think we right now have home visiting in 24 of those counties. So I recognize that in my 15 to 20 minutes with a family, I am only going to see a small portion of what's going on with that family. You know, what a home visitor can do with that family is just, head and shoulders above what I can do. So we're ready to partner. We're trying to spread the good news, make sure that our colleagues know, and make sure that we actually have a way of communicating. That's one of the issues in Georgia is it's hard for me as a physician to refer to home visiting. That's the part that we're trying to figure out. I'm not sure what your experience is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers, time, accessibility, really easy, fast, like a lot of that same stuff. Interesting. Thanks. Other questions anybody wants to unmute and say, ask, comments?
Hi, I think what you had discussed about mental health and in that stigma and how you brought that to a highlight is so important. And this is like the first time I've heard it from a professional, really discuss that. And it's so important. I just thank you so much for highlighting that.
Oh, no, it's probably one of the most important things that I feel like I do as a pediatrician, because the truth is, a family, a mom who, and we haven't always been the best at this in the medical community, but now we are trying to routinely screen our moms for postpartum depression, because we know that we're often the only professional they're going to see in that first 6 weeks. So that's an area where a mom can really get into trouble. And so we're seeing those babies. So we have to consider the mom as our patient too, because if that mom's not healthy, she is not going to be able to give that baby, to address that baby's physical health or their mental health. And then just in general, even beyond the postpartum period, when a parent is in crisis or when a parent has a mental health issue, we know how that impacts the child and the family. And so, it's almost malpractice not to consider it and deal with it. We're slowly moving. We haven't always been there, but we're moving in that direction in that medical profession.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. McFadden, for this wonderful information-filled presentation. It's been wonderful.
I hope I didn't totally overwhelm you. There's so much I wanted to share with you, and so many words, so little time, right?
No, it was great. Lots of resources too for folks to follow up with. So thank